There's a lot of misrepresentation of vintage out there in the online, on the forums, on YouTube, everywhere. And it occurs to me that vintage might not mean what you think it is. So people that came up in the 90s or the 2000s, they didn't really live through it. They don't know what it really means. It's just sort of a term to them, which has taken on kind of a false meaning over the years. So I'm going to take this chance here to explain where vintage comes from and what it really means. And to do so, I'm going to talk about Fender, and I'm going to talk mostly just about Stratocasters, because that's basically what I know the most about, both those. But the timeline for Gibson follows along with Fender. They sort of match the rise and fall and rise again of both companies. It does kind of match, even though the stories are very different. So let's get to the early era of Fender. In 1949, Leo Fender invented what we now think of as the Telecaster. And by 1950, it was being sold and shipped and delivered and all those sorts of things. So that would really be the beginning of our story, is 1950. And after that, you had the P-Bass came along. In 1954, we got the Stratocaster. And we'll mostly stick to Stratocaster for the story here. After that, we had the Jazz Bass, you have the offset guitars like the Jazzmaster. And pretty much every famous model that Fender is known for came out in the CBS era, with some exceptions that came out later on, like the Telecaster Deluxe and things, which are cool guitars. But this is known as the pre-CBS era, or the classic or golden era of guitars. They're known for having more handwork and more sculpting. See, for Stratocasters, that was a big deal. The contour body was a big deal, because everything up to the Stratocaster, for the most part, had hard edges to it, hard corners, big thick bound bodies. There was no relief there for your arm cut and the belly cut. You can see the belly cut under there, the arm cut over here. So the roundness of the body was actually very significant, and the early Strats had even more rounding than we're used to today. So if we look at this area right here, where we've got the belly cut, see how it gets thin there, then there's the arm cut as this comes around, and we've got this thick area here. Well, in the early versions, the belly cut and the arm cut actually matched up, and this little piece here is actually very thin, and they just follow each other around. So little things like that made the guitars so much more comfortable, and because they were solid body, it really didn't affect the sound. But that's one of the things that is a defining feature of the Stratocasters. And over time, those would go away, and they probably wouldn't really see them again until the custom shop. Now this era, this pre-CBS era, is the era by which all Stratocasters and other models of Fender guitars are judged by. And then, like I said, we're just going to talk about the Stratocasters, because what happened to the Stratocasters it happened to Stratocasters first and went to the other guitars afterwards, and there are a lot of changes to come. So there is no light without dark, there's no heat without cold, and there's no classic era without the CBS era. In 1964, Leo Fender, citing poor health and some say declining interest, sold Fender to CBS, which is the Columbia Broadcasting System. It's a system of television radio networks in the States. And that is the second part of our story here. It's the end of the golden era. So 1950 to 1964 is the pre-CBS era. That is the golden or classic pre-CBS era right there. Nobody knew it at the time. Everything gets a name afterwards, but it was the most important era for decades to come. Now, once CBS got hold of the company, they started making changes. Now, most of the changes weren't super significant for a little while here. We're talking about the early era of CBS ownership, from 64 through about 71, 72, really. And so some of the changes you got, there was the new logos. So there's a transition logo, then there was the more official logo. I think the logo changed maybe one more time in the CBS era. You get the large headstock, which was really just so that they could put a bigger logo on it. It was easier to read. Yeah, so it's just a big billboard. We talked about the body contours. Well, the body contours in the CBS era, over time, were less and less significant, less and less profound, less and less contoured, really. So we've got this nice large 60s, or it's really a 60s version of the body cut. It started to shrink. So instead of coming from all the way out here and going all the way out here, it would come in a little bit, and it'd be less rounded and less defined. Same thing with the arm cut. I think you can see it in the light there really nicely, where it kind of turns. So a lot of these things, that being one of the contours being one of the most important parts of the Stratocaster marketing or whatever, and just comfort for players, is that roundedness. Well, that roundedness was starting to go away, and they did that to cut costs, because the contours take actual time and effort, and you have to put them on different machines and do all those things. So it was cheaper if they made the cuts less significant. You also had the plastics changed, the dots. At this point, you would have had the rosewood fingerboards, but the dot materials changed. In 1968-ish, they started switching from the nitro finish to the polyurethane finish. And then there were a few other changes. Now, none of these are super significant. So yes, there are little bits and pieces there that people would prefer or not prefer. But the real defining quality of this time wasn't the cosmetic changes or the little bits and bobbles here. It was just a decline in the quality of the guitars. We already talked about the lessening of the contours. There's also just lessening of the build quality. So less things to point out, like, oh, this thing changed, and more just they weren't as well built in this era. And we started to already see the seeds of the vintage market taking place. 1954 was our first and most important date for the Stratocaster. That was when Stratocasters were introduced. 1972 would maybe be the next most important date for Stratocasters. And what really happened in 1972 was they switched to the 3-bolt neck plate, the dreaded 3-bolt neck plate. So the 3-bolt neck plate is most significant because it's kind of a symbol of Fender and all our cost-cutting measures and things that were even to come through the rest of the 70s. It's really a symbol of when Fender quality really declined steeply. It had already started declining under the CBS era, and then it started to fall sharply off after the 1972 era. And that 3-bolt neck plate was a significant one because it's something you can actually point to as that is the era when Fender was at its worst. But also, it really wouldn't have been important if the guitars were built well. If you have a nice, well-built guitar with a tight neck cavity right here, where the neck and the body meet, the 3-bolt neck plate wouldn't matter. And what actually happened, if you're unfamiliar with it, is the neck plate or neck cavities here, the body joint, they were getting sloppy, so they were just loose in there. And what would happen is the necks you could pull them out of alignment. So if you were playing a gig and there's a mic stand right here in front of you and you want to go to the other side of the mic stand, you want to pick your guitar up and do one of those such things. Well, what happened is, if you did something like that, there's chances are fair that you would pull the neck out of alignment. I mean, not nearly this much, but you pull the neck out of alignment and it would go completely out of tune. And even though you could push the neck back into alignment or tap it or whatever you did, it wouldn't go back into tune. And then, so if you bumped the guitar on things, it would go out of tune. If you just had your singer or bass player came over and stood next to you, it would go out of tune. And so that became sort of a lightning rod for the criticism of the guitars at the time. Now, other things that changed is, again, the contours got less and less refined and less significant. They were cheaper. Instead of having a nice rounded, if we get it back in the light here, nice rounded transition here from the arm carve to the body, what you would have is a straight piece here, a corner going through there, and then a flat piece going over for the rest of the body. So just a coarsening of the quality of the workmanship. The bridge and the tuners became die-cast. Die-cast is a cheaper way of doing things. You take steel and you add other things to it to make more steel, but in doing so you make it softer and less resilient to steel strings that will just eat right into them. So the bridges were less quality, the tuners were less quality. The bodies, instead of being a desirable body, would be a one-piece body, but wood isn't milled that wide. It's actually more milled. I think it's about like a 2/3 sort of a thing for a body. So you take 2 pieces and you make a body. You can make 3-piece bodies, and they're fine too. I think Eric Clapton's Blackie, according to the custom shop, it's a 3-piece body. But once you get past that, the 3-piece bodies, and you get into the multi-piece bodies, 4 is fine, especially if you paint it. And so you don't see the seams, but they were doing transparent finishes with multi-piece bodies, and they could be 5 or 6 pieces, which is really, I don't know if it makes that big a difference as far as tone and sustain goes, but it really makes it cheap. It makes it look cheap, makes it feel cheap, makes it just seem cheap. We talked about they switched from, starting in 1968, from the nitrocellulose finish to the polyurethane finish. Well, one of the complaints that people had about the polyurethane finish is that they weren't spraying it on in a nice, thin, even coat. They were spraying it on really thick and heavy, especially on the necks. So the necks had this, it's kind of an old school polyurethane too, so when it heats up it gets sticky, and it was really significantly thick on the necks, which affected the way that they feel and the way the guitar is played. On the bodies, some of the things that a polyurethane finish, even modern polyurethane, it's a much better paint than the nitro is. But what we love about nitro is how it's a bad paint, so how it wears off and It shows a lot of use. It shows up all in the paint and everything. Well, poly, because it's a much better paint, it's stronger and it takes a lot more to wear it down and to chip it. So when it does chip, it actually chips in larger, chunkier ways. And then when the finish is thick, it would have deeper chunks coming out of it, which is not. It doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good. It really makes the guitars kind of seem cheap, like it's this hard shell thing with chunks coming out of it. There are other things. So the pickups themselves went from having staggered pole pieces, which is sort of a traditional thing, at least since the mid '50s on, and to having flat pole pieces. So the pieces are all even. Pole pieces are all even. So again, it's not a massive thing because they've done flat pole piece pickups that are well liked and very nice. But it's more just another symbol of the cheapening of the guitars. Even things like the logo, where you've got the contour body decal, they took that off, and I mean, it saves pennies. Was it worth it that much to change these things? And but the defining quality isn't so much these little cosmetic changes. It's all about the declining quality of the guitar. I think we talked about the neck pockets, we talked about the sloppiness of the paint, we talked about the multi-piece bodies instead of being high quality. They were super heavy for whatever reason. I don't even know how they found wood that was so heavy. So for a guitar that should be 7 pounds, between 7 and 8 pounds, there are examples that were 10 or 11 pounds. I mean, we're talking Les Paul weight there, which is a much thicker guitar. So I have no idea why they were so heavy, but it was really this drop in quality. And it made people think, well, why would I buy a new Strat when I can just go on the used market and buy a used Strat that is built better, has better materials and workmanship, and it saves some money? So why buy new when I could buy used in that era? And thus, the vintage market is born. So by the end of the 70s, the used prices for Strats and other guitars, Les Pauls and whatever, started to skyrocket, even surpassing the new prices for Stratocaster. So in other words, at that point, a 10-year-old guitar, maybe even less than 10-year-old guitar, was actually commanding a higher price than the brand new guitars on the market. And the used market quickly figured this part out, and that's the used dealers. And they stole a term from the wine industry that we now are familiar with, called vintage. And so a vintner is someone who makes wine. It's a wine producer, whether it's a person or a company, it's a vintner. And vintage refers to just the date of a wine. If you had a 1954, that's just the year it was made. It didn't mean anything beyond that. So 1988 is just the year it was made. The 20 years and older aspect of it, which comes around, that really didn't play into it at the time. It still made sense mathematically because 20 years from, say, 1977 would be 1957. So it does work mathematically, but that's not really the core spirit of it. And then, so that term vintage was really just a way to make the used guitars sound classier, since they were charging a premium for them. And then even by the early 1980s at Fender, they acknowledged that the vintage market was significant and real, and they put out the first American vintage reissues, stealing that term from the used market, the vintage term, and it became, at that point, really an industry term. What does vintage really mean? Well, the vintage in terms of guitars was entirely invented to differentiate the pre-CBS era from the CBS era, mostly because of the decline in quality. So if we're going to say that the pre-CBS era guitars are better built and we're charging more for them, it was just a nice, classy way. And everyone knew it at the time. Everyone knew it was a marketing term. They knew it was being manipulative, same way that pre-owned car is a used car. We all understood it. It's nothing crazy, but it's really just to differentiate pre-CBS from the CBS era. And that brings up, what does vintage then not mean? The entire concept of vintage is really just to differentiate the pre-CBS era from the CBS era because of the quality issues in the CBS era and the continuing slide in quality. Some say like massive drop off in quality. What it does not mean is that when your guitar turns 20, it magically transforms into a better guitar. It just was there. The entire concept was to differentiate the low quality 70s CBS era guitars with the perceived higher quality 50s and 60s era guitars. Now you can debate if the 70s guitars were as bad as their reputation. Now, I had one, and I had a late 70s Strat, and every little thing that people say about Strats was absolutely true with that one. It was inordinately heavy, had a multi-piece body, had the cheap bridge, it had a neck that would come shockingly out of place without a whole lot of effort, which would knock the guitar out of tune. It had most, if not all, of the problems that you associate with 70s Stratocasters. So I would say that it's not a myth. They are real, but it doesn't mean that they're all like that. And you can also debate, were the 50s and 60s Strats really that great? What you can't really debate is that the guitars don't have a magic transformation at the 20 or 30 or 40, 50, 60 year mark. If it was a good guitar, it was a good guitar. If it was a lousy guitar, it will remain a lousy guitar. If it was a good guitar and no one maintained it over 4 decades, it will probably be a lousy guitar at the end of all of that. So I hope this helps you understand more where the vintage aspect of it comes in and why that's such a, the 50s and 60s Fender era is so sought after and so romanticized, really. But that was really, like, that would be the reason why people would want those guitars. They want to have those crazy body contours back. I mean, if you look at the first couple of years, maybe, even the headstocks had rounded edges to them. Like, so much extra little fine work that was done to those things that we don't see again except for the custom shop. So if you came up from the 90s and 2000s or later, even came up more recently, and you didn't know about the 70s Strats setting up the entire reason there's a vintage market, well, maybe now you do know, and maybe vintage just doesn't mean what you thought it meant.